Am I too harsh toward low church Protestants? That's a question I want to address in this particular video. Now, the reason I'm making this video is because Dr. Gavin Ortlund made a video recently dealing with the issue of, low church Protestantism. And he describes what is sometimes seen to be a kind of a dismissive, maybe, or arrogant kind of attitude, an attitude of superiority that those more in the kind of high church Protestant traditions, basically Lutherans and Anglicans, but Presbyterians more to some degree as well, toward those who are of more kind of low church Protestant traditions. So we're speaking really about Baptists or those who maybe are in non-denominational churches or things like that. There are a number of things I want to say in response to this. And I left some of these as a comment on Dr. Ortlund's video, but I thought it might be worth kind of delving into this conversation in the video quickly, because I know that a lot of my viewers obviously watch his videos, and also many of my viewers are low church Protestants, are in those kinds of traditions as well. So, the first thing I want to say is I do want to acknowledge that there is a kind of superior type of attitude that many people have who do convert from a low church to a higher church kind of tradition. And I think that we need to acknowledge that that's really an issue. And really that just comes down to human pride and human sin. And the fact is this, that we are all self-righteous because of our corrupted natures. And that means that we will use absolutely anything that we can to place ourselves in some kind of a position of superiority over others, right? We all have that experience of being like the Pharisee who thanks God that he is not like other men, right? I thank you, God, that I am not like those silly Baptists, Of course, the self-righteousness is a problem that we all have. And I think you find it in those circles too, and just in different ways. So we always need to be aware of the temptations of the old Adam. And the temptation of the old Adam is always going to be toward making ourselves seem superior to other people in one way or another. We find new ways of becoming self-righteous all the time. We are really good at doing that. Or, as John Calvin said, our hearts are factories of idols, and we just create new idols all the time. And oftentimes that displays itself in some kind of self-righteousness. So it's an issue. And especially it's an issue for those who just kind of convert from one thing to another. And this is why people have talked about this whole cage stage kind of thing, if you've heard this language that, and this initially was talking about Calvinism, but it also could be applied to all sorts of other things. It tends to be applied in other directions today. And that is to say that, when somebody first converts, they should be locked in a cage for a while before they have a chance to talk to other people about it, because when we get excited about something, we have zeal for something that we've discovered. The way that we tend to deal with that zeal is that we tend to try to convert other people to our point of view, and sometimes in our zeal, that zeal can become, again, a self-righteousness, and it can become an unhealthy form of judgment rather than a telling others of some truth that we've discovered for the purpose of actually serving maybe the good of the other person, at least oftentimes in the way that we explain that or the way that we approach it. It can be a less than helpful manner. And then I want to say, and I know that I have plenty of critiques of pop evangelicalism, and I use that term pop evangelicalism because I never know what to call, evangelicalism, and evangelicalism itself is such a difficult term to define because it means so many things to many people. And I know I've been very critical myself of a lot of trends in the American church. But I do also want to say that, in my own life, I was in an evangelical youth group, went to an evangelical high school, and was more in a kind of Reformed tradition. I wasn't a Reformed tradition, at least in high school. My early years was a little bit different than that. But the time that I spent among evangelicals, and so far as the Reformed can be classified, of course, as evangelicals, I don't think that all of that was bad. I don't look back on my evangelical years in youth group or the evangelical music I listened to or all the tooth and nail bands. I don't look back on that stuff and come at it with an attitude of like bitterness or something. I'm very thankful for it. I'm very thankful for the passion for the Bible that evangelicals have. I'm very thankful for the passion for mission and evangelism. All those I think are very good things. So I'm not one who looks back with resentment at any of these things. No, I think there are plenty of issues that evangelicalism had, especially in my years growing up. But every church and every tradition at every time has its own unique challenges, and that means it's going to have its own unique errors and also its unique strengths. So I think it is important that we acknowledge both errors and strengths. And I think the strength, the error that I saw, at least in evangelicalism in my time, was that there really wasn't a prioritizing of the life of the mind at all. And I think that's a significant danger. There was a prioritizing of the emotions, much more so. And I think that is the reason, or one of the reasons, there are many others than just this, why a lot of friends that I had didn't seem to have a sustainable faith. Like, it didn't seem like that there was enough kind of rigor of the mind for them to actually be able to think deeply about the things of the faith to such an extent that when they were challenged through rational argumentation, they just really weren't equipped to address or deal with those challenges at all. So I think that's a weakness. But at the same time, I think the strengths are in building community, strengths in evangelism, strengths in mission, a passion for mission and evangelism that I think many of our more high church traditions are very much lacking. So there's positive benefit there as well. So now I want to turn specifically to some points that I had made in a comment, but I'm going to make here about Dr. Ortlund's video. Now, one of the points that Dr. Ortlund made was that, it's really not fair when we say judge the entirety of the Baptist tradition by, the worst of the tradition. You can always grab onto some crazy person and make your judgments on, say, who Baptists are, who any tradition is, based on the most, like the worst forms of that tradition. And of course, all of us have problems in our traditions, and all of us have our wackos, and all of us have our fringe groups, and those who we really wish weren't representing us publicly. That's always going to be the case in every single Christian tradition. And so, the question is kind of, why is it that so many people with the Baptist tradition seem to maybe associate Baptists much more with those worst examples of that tradition, when we don't tend to do the same thing when it comes to Lutherans, or when it comes to Anglicans, or when it comes to Presbyterians. I think that there is an element to this that is more than just taking the worst examples, though that is something that happens, and I think that's something that happens across the board. I see that people doing that with Lutherans as well. They grab onto the most kind of antinomian forms of Lutheranism and then define Lutheranism by that. I know Reformed seminaries that do that because of the books that they assign or articles that they assign to understand Lutheran views on things. So I think that's a problem kind of all around. But I think that here's the difficulty that I have with the Baptist tradition in particular. If someone wants to, say, align Lutheranism with its most kind of liberal or progressive branch or branches, we have a way of kind of judging whether or not that is a valid expression of Lutheranism, whether it's a consistent expression of Lutheranism, and that is that we have a confessional tradition. And so when I'm speaking about Lutheranism, I often say confessional Lutheranism. I'm identifying the doctrine that was in our confession. So we have a standard whereby we can judge whether or not a particular congregation or pastor is actually being faithful to the inherited Lutheran tradition. That is, we have our confessional tradition. The same thing is true of Presbyterians, right? So if you have a Presbyterian church that maybe has Presbyterian in their name, but they don't hold to anything in the Westminster Confession, or they deny half of the things that it says, I have a clear standard, right, where I could say, okay, well, this has a Presbyterian name, in the church, but when I look at the actual dogmatic or doctrinal standards, and I look at the congregation, I can judge the standards or practices of the congregation by what the Westminster Confession, the Westminster Standards actually says. And so we have a way to define our traditions apart from just any church who happens to have this name stuck on it, right? Because unfortunately, all of our traditions have their forms of expression that aren't consistent with those traditions, including Rome as well. So I don't think it's just the case, and the East. I don't think it's the case just with Protestant churches. So we all have those people that aren't bound to the actual doctrine that they say that they take a vow to teach according to. With Baptists, that's just not quite the case, and I think that's the difficulty when it comes to Baptists. Now you do have, of course, Baptist confessions of faith. You have the 1689 London Baptist Confession, which is the most well-known, but you have earlier Baptist confessions as well, 1646. Oh my gosh, that year might be wrong. And I know there was a whole kind of movement among Baptists at one time arguing for like this thing that they called New Covenant theology that was taken from the earlier Baptist confessions and stuff, the later ones. And then you also have the Baptist Faith and Message, which is like the binding document of the SBC. It's very vague, though. So the thing is, you do have some confessions within Baptist churches, but there's no singular confessional tradition in the same way. And so this is why you have your Free Will Baptists, you have your Particular Baptists, and there isn't a unifying confession that defines what a Baptist is exactly. So if you look at the largest, more conservative, it's the largest Baptist church in the U.S., but a church that is intentionally conservative in a theological sense, meaning that it is a church that holds to the authority of Scripture very strongly. The Southern Baptist Convention doesn't really have a very strong standard of statement of faith, and this is why you have all of these various movements and debates within the Southern Baptist Convention about, about Calvinism or about the Nicene Creed. This was a debate, and I know there's a lot of political stuff underneath that, and I know it's complicated, the whole issue there. But the point is that within the Baptist tradition, you don't have the same kind of, here is one clear standard by which Baptist theology is to be judged. So for that reason, it's very difficult to have a really clear definition of what Baptists are that we can use then to judge, is this someone authentically in line with the tradition, or is this person not authentically in line with the tradition? And I think that's just kind of an inherent weakness of that particular tradition. And so, if you're talking about someone who affirms one of those confessions, I think it's very different. But Baptist as a label, as a whole, I don't think does have the same kind of unity that you find whether it's a Lutheran or Presbyterian, or even an Anglican, though they're pretty loose in terms of what's affirmed in the 39 Articles as well. But I think some of this comes back to Baptist ecclesiology, because Baptist ecclesiology is by its nature, it's independent. It's very congregationalist. And so even when you have like a binding doctrinal statement from something like the Southern Baptist Convention, the things that the Southern Baptist Convention proclaims and does and decisions that it makes aren't really binding on the individual congregations in the same way that they would be within different traditions. So there's a kind of looseness in the definitions of what a Baptist is that is just inherent to the Baptist system. And so there's where I think the difficulty is. That's not even a point of critique. I'm just kind of outlining why I think it's the case that it's very easy to maybe dismiss Baptists in a way that it wouldn't be with these other traditions, because there isn't a clear standard in precisely the same way. Talking about this kind of, maybe opposition that's set up between the high church Protestant groups and then maybe the low church Protestant groups, is a lot of our present discussions are really being formed by the particular situation that we're facing right now and the trends that we're seeing in the church. And so the trends that we're seeing in the church are, in many ways, we are seeing converts from Protestant tradition, especially young male converts, to Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, as numbers have shown, these numbers are not like, they're not, what we're not seeing is that this kind of turnover, a move from one church tradition to the other, is actually resulting in more growth in Rome or the East than there is in evangelical traditions. It's actually exactly the opposite. So to some degree, it's been kind of overblown. And I think the internet distorts our way of viewing things. But what a lot of people in the more high church traditions are seeing is that people go from a particular kind of what's called Protestantism, at least, in something that's really not rooted at all, maybe a non-denominational megachurch. We see people going from there and then hearing the claims of Rome or the East, and then they kind of jump over there. And there is people aren't even looking at what are the historic Protestant traditions. And so I think there is a tendency for us, because of the nature of the situation we're seeing, to want to say, we are not like them. Look, there are high church Protestant traditions too. Like, you don't have to abandon the principles of the Reformation in order to find what you're looking for, in order to find tradition, in order to find history, in order to find liturgy, in order to find sacramental theology, and all of these benefits and blessings in the faith that have been inherited throughout the history of the church are within Protestant churches. And it's not fair to look at Protestantism as some kind of universal thing. I mean, Protestantism is so vague, we don't even really agree on how to use the term. So for this reason, there is a current trend to really emphasize discontinuity with these low church traditions, because a lot of us are just trying to tell people that, like, we exist. You can't judge all of us, everyone who's in some way an heir of the Reformation, whether the label Protestant is valid or not for like a megachurch. I would say not, but we have these truths that you're seeking to find there. So we want you to look at our historic traditions as well. So I think that's part of this kind of move toward probably discontinuity as well. Okay, and then I do want to get to that question of, like, okay, what exactly is a Protestant in the first place? And Protestantism, as a phrase, is one that is difficult to define because when you have like the Lutherans and you have the Calvinists, we disagree on a lot of things. We agree on a lot of things, but we disagree on a lot of things too. And so there is both continuity and discontinuity between these two traditions. And famously, Luther refused to shake Zwingli's hand at Marburg because of the sacramental differences, and the sacramental differences have still separated our traditions. And we have some again very important commonalities. We have some very important differences as well. And so because of those differences that we have, it's really not even that easy to kind of lump us together as if we're part of one tradition, because we're not. We're two different traditions that arose out of some common concerns in a common historical period. And we have mutually influenced each other in various ways, but we are distinctive traditions. So Protestantism as a unifying term sometimes can be kind of difficult because of the differences under that broader umbrella. But nonetheless, I'm not one who wants to abandon the term Protestantism. I think there are some Lutherans who just don't like the term at all because of how confusing it might be. And there are Anglicans who don't like the term, who say that they're kind of the via media. But I think when you're really talking about Protestantism in a historic perspective, we have to have some boundaries, right, as to what that means. It can't just mean not under the Pope. And that's how Roman Catholics tend to use the term Protestant. So, well, that doesn't mean much of anything. I mean, you could include any cult under the term Protestant, which they often do when they come up with those like crazy inflated numbers, or any like random individual congregation or some guy that says, hey, I'm a pastor, this is my church, without any valid call, ordination, or anything else. And they say, well, that's a new Protestant denomination. Well, like there's no connection between that and the Reformation. So you have to have some basic principle that makes somebody Protestant. And so I think you've got a couple principles that are really core to the Reformation that both the Lutherans and the Reformed are agreed on. And one of those is sola scriptura, so your question of authority, and then the other is sola fide, justification through faith alone. Those are really the core points of doctrine that unites both of those traditions, even as much as they disagree, even in the particulars of those two ideas, but at least those kind of two underlying principles. And so in terms of that question then of sola scriptura, a classic Reformation view of sola scriptura is one that recognizes the value in tradition, recognizes the need for confessions of faith. The classic Reformation approach to sola scriptura is not what some people have called solo scriptura or nuda scriptura, just scripture by itself without any tradition, without any church structure, without any value at all in formal liturgy or anything like that. Now, if you have abandoned that principle of sola scriptura and have moved toward a solo or nuda scriptura approach, you're really not using the same approach of authority that defines the Protestant Reformation. You're doing something that is far different. And so are you really a Protestant at that point? I've said no, because I think you need to have some unified general principles of what authority is, if that's what differentiates us from Rome. And so if you move either toward a view that says that tradition is definitively authoritative in some way, okay, well, then you're not Protestant in any meaningful sense. But also, if you have moved toward a approach that says that tradition does not have any authority in any sense at all, well, then you're not meaningfully really Protestant either, because you're not working with the same principles of authority that define the Reformation traditions. So the issue that I have then when it comes to Baptists is it seems like among the Baptists, many of them do take that approach. And so, there are a lot of Baptists that I love, right? Baptists that I have that are friends that are doing really great work. And there are Baptists that I recommend regularly. Okay, so a lot of the guys doing retrieval work are really fantastic. Like David Haynes, his work is great. He's got a little book on like metaphysics that's wonderful. I don't know that it's out yet, but it's really good. Then you've got Sam Parkinson, who I've had on this program, talking about the beatific vision. Great guy, great work. Gavin Ortland, of course, highly recommend in a lot of areas. I think he's really excellent. So obviously we disagree on things, but I do with all these people, but I recommend people I disagree with all the time. Because, what fun is it if everybody agrees with you anyway? Ronnie Kurtz is another one. You've got the guys associated with Matthew Barrett and kind of what he's doing at Credo. You have, James Dolezal, his work on divine simplicities. Right now we're working on a large philosophical work on angels. These guys are doing fantastic work. There are a lot of Baptists that I think are great, and these guys are clearly within what we're calling the Protestant tradition because they're working within the principles of the magisterial Reformation. And so if those guys define Baptists, well, I think very differently of Baptists than I do if you're talking about our little Fundy Baptist church down the road from where I live, where the pastor thinks that we're all going to hell because we're not part of his little group and use any Bible other than the King James Bible, though I do use the King James Bible pretty regularly, and believe in weird Jesuit conspiracy theories and hand out chick tracts. Like, it's a totally different thing. So the question is, how do you define the Baptist tradition when you don't have the kind of clarity you do in other traditions? So like, who's to say that these guys who are clearly being faithful to the general Reformation principles versus those who are in these groups that really don't have any value in tradition at all, or at least they don't think they do, but they're just valuing a different tradition. But just setting that aside. So that's really the issue here, is when I'm communicating with those who are within the Baptist tradition or talking about Baptists, it's very difficult, because I think the question is not just high church Protestants versus low church Protestants, which it would be if we're talking about, say, those people that I had mentioned. But it's also a question even deeper than that, which is, what is Protestantism altogether, or are Baptists even within that Reformation tradition at all? Because it seems like a lot of them aren't. And that's something that I think is difficult to, at least for me, that's something that's difficult to tease out. I will say, though, I am not, I didn't grow up around Baptists. I didn't grow up around Southern Baptists. I'm from New England, and I've lived in the Midwest, and I live in New York, and I've lived in New Jersey. I was born there. So I've lived mostly in the Northeast, but some 6 years in the Midwest. And none of those areas were very Baptist heavy. And to be honest, when I have visited the South and been in kind of Baptist circles, I tend to be very confused. I do. I tend to be very confused. I'm confused about their ecclesiology, even the way that they use words and talk about things. It's something that I'm just not part of the culture. So I understand that, and I don't want to speak in a way that I'm as an outsider, form my views wrongly or bringing assumptions that are incorrect. So, and maybe that is the case, and I'm happy to listen to people correct me. But at least as far as I understand it, it doesn't seem to me that there is a consistent, clear doctrinal standard for what makes somebody a Baptist. And then I want to say, I think, as much as there is, yes, there can be an unhealthy, sinful judgment of that flows out of self-righteousness and arrogance of those in high church traditions versus low church traditions. But there is a reaction on the other side as well. And I talk to people who join Lutheran congregations who are looking for history, looking for sacramentology, reading the church fathers, and they aren't compelled by the claims of Rome, and they end up in a Lutheran congregation, or sometimes they end up in an Anglican congregation as well. And I hear this story all the time, which is, they say, the hardest thing to do is talk to my family, because my family are Baptists, and they're convinced that I am now not a Christian because I am attending this church. Happens constantly. And so maybe this attitude of arrogance that, yes, does exist in some, flows out of a response to a view that would say that anybody who moves toward these traditions is a papist, and for them that's the worst thing you could possibly be, right? And is probably damned eternally because of their views of baptism or the sacraments in general, or whatever issue it might be. And so there is a kind of tension, I think, that probably forms quite a bit of this. There's something else I want to say. I watched a recent video where Trent Horan was talking about this within Rome, which is, and I hear this regularly, which is, okay, well, maybe you have more people joining, say, non-denominational churches or evangelical churches in a broad sense than you do Roman Catholic tradition or Eastern Orthodox or Lutheran. But the ACNA seems to be, at least in my experience, the congregations seem to be growing in a way that these others aren't, for whatever reason. But, and I don't know if that's universally the case. That's anecdotal, so maybe it might not be the case. But if you look at the growth in the evangelical churches, one of the ways to kind of respond to that is, well, we've seen all these conversions to high church traditions. And I encountered this all the time, obviously. It's kind of what I do. So I'm encountering young men, not only young men, but, my listening audience is 80% young men. And so, yeah, it is more men than women, but women as well. But I see these people that are converting to these high church traditions, and they are doing so in a way that is very well informed. They know what they're talking about. They're passionate. They love the liturgy. They love the history. And so on the one hand, we are getting, in our traditions, we are receiving new converts who are really passionate, often very intelligent, very well read, and they're bringing kind of a new fire into the congregation, which is fantastic. It's a wonderful thing. But this can lead to, as Trent Horn talked about, this idea that, well, yeah, maybe the evangelicals are getting more converts, but like Rome, and I think the same is true of us, the high church traditions are getting the more intelligent people. Like we're getting all the smart people. And this, as Trent Horn said, like, but this is not like what God desires. Like this isn't a point in favor of us to say, well, we're losing people, but we're getting the better people. We shouldn't judge the church and divide the church based on how intelligent people might be. We have the superior Christians. We've got like your lesser Christians, who are those in those silly non-denom churches, and then you've got like your superior smart Christians, your enlightened Christians, and they're in all the high church traditions. That is not a healthy way to look at all. And I think that it's maybe an easy way or an easy route to go to kind of explain away what is a real difficulty, which is our churches are really struggling. I mean, this is a fact. Lutheran congregations, confessional Lutheran congregations, are really struggling. Many of them are closing. I think things are going to look very different in 10 years. At the same time, though, we do have this resurgence, these young people coming to these churches with a new excitement. And I think that will help revitalize these churches, but we also do have to, reckon with the future where we have far less of them, far less churches, and ones that are just smaller, or we have to have pastors that are working part-time and not full-time. And that's kind of the reality of the church situation right now. I think it is going to be the case that those who are probably more intellectually driven, those who are reading more, those who are thinking deeply through issues more, are probably more likely to go to high church traditions. And that is going to be the tendency, because I think your kind of non-denominational churches especially are not deeply rooted. They don't really have a lot of answers intellectually, and especially with the kind of seeker-sensitive mentality that still exists very much in some of those congregations. That's kind of intentional. And so there is going to be this kind of natural trend of those who are more kind of intellectually minded, who read more, that they are going to move from low to high church. But we also do need to be careful that our churches aren't just catering to the life of the mind and nothing else. And I think that's a kind of perennial danger for some of the high church traditions. I don't think that's actually historically nearly true in Lutheranism in the same way that it is in Anglicanism, actually. Especially because a lot of our churches and our larger churches are in like very rural areas that aren't people that have doctorates or anything like that. But in terms of young converts, that does at least seem to be largely the trend. Well, that's kind of all I wanted to say. Just wanted to put some thoughts out there on some of these conversations. I think it's important to keep having these conversations. And hope you enjoyed this. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't subscribed already, and we'll see you in the next video. God bless.